So, in case the title of the video was not enough indication, the original plan to cover Call of Duty Black Ops 6 was to do a full review. I would play through the entire single-player campaign. I would mess around with the Zombies mode a bit just to show it off and say, hey, this is what the Zombies mode is, because I have absolutely never given a single solitary crap about the Zombies mode in any of the Call of Duty games, and this one is no exception, of course. But at the very least, whenever I go to review a Call of Duty game, I will go through the entire single-player campaign, and then I will mess around with the versus multiplayer enough to get a good idea of how it plays, which usually means I will go through the entire multiplayer progression, at least for the base game, not necessarily for all the stuff that gets added in post-launch seasons. And so I'll at the very least unlock all of the perks, equipment, weapons, etc., and then by that point I've got a very good grasp of how the game plays, and whether or not it's ultimately worth recommending the game for purchase. And once I'm comfortable making that determination, then I will put together the review. It'll have the review score at the end and all that. The thing is, this time I did manage to get through all of the main multiplayer progression, so I unlock all the perks, the weapons, the equipment, etc., and I got a good chance to mess around with all that. But weirdly enough, in this case, I just can't force myself to finish the campaign. And I really do mean force myself to finish it, because I wasn't having any fun with the campaign this time around. That's pretty weird, because normally the campaign is something that I can at least get something out of in the Call of Duty franchise, even in the games that are generally not considered very good. But with Black Ops 6, I just couldn't bring myself to care. There are a few reasons for this. The first is that the story is just not very good. It's not the worst ever or anything like that, but it's a very bland espionage thriller kind of thing, where the Black Ops team is betrayed and has to go rogue in order to prove their innocence and root out the actual bad actor that was framing them for everything, and so on and so forth. Very straightforward, by-the-numbers, TV espionage series slop, effectively. And while the story wouldn't ordinarily be enough to tank the experience, it was something that was desperately needed, because the gameplay experience in the campaign of Black Ops 6 is just really bland and boring for the most part. It's all stuff you've seen and done before in previous Call of Duty games, and it was often done better in those other games. And to make matters worse in that regard, it also suffers, although not anywhere near as severely, from some of the same design problems that plagued Modern Warfare 2023, where they try to introduce a bit more open level design at points, but it ends up basically just being repurposed Warzone content. That doesn't happen quite as badly in Black Ops 6. It's definitely more curated campaign content when it opens up the level design. But even though I actually didn't make it quite far into the game enough to hit this point, I know there is a point later on in the game where they just basically repurposed zombie mode content for the single-player campaign. And not only do I have no desire to play through that content, but I actually just got bored of the campaign well before I got to that point anyway. It certainly didn't help that they introduced a progression system into the single-player campaign where you need to collect money scattered around the levels so that you can purchase upgrades that will allow you to have things like improved reload speed, or do a bit of extra damage, or have a bit more health, or things like that. But the saying that applies to this situation is, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. The upgrades are so mild and largely inconsequential that there's not really much of a point to going out of your way to find all the various cash items and such that you'll need in order to afford those upgrades. It's just obvious padding, and the more I was messing with the single player, the more it just felt like the padding was the majority of the experience. So eventually, having not enjoyed the single-player campaign up to that point, I decided that it just wasn't really worth finishing the campaign, and so I did continue to mess around with multiplayer a bit, because it, of course, has its ups and downs. I mean, it's Call of Duty multiplayer. Obviously, if you enjoy the Call of Duty style of mechanics, then you'll probably enjoy the multiplayer on some level, at least some of the time, so that's what was happening for me. Occasionally I was enjoying it, but even with that, the annoyances just kept piling up. I mean, there's issues that have been in this engine for years, and they've never really managed to fix them. Things like the wildly overtuned skill-based matchmaking that makes any match for people in the mid to high skill bracket just an absolute crapshoot as to whether it's going to be even the slightest bit enjoyable or not, and completely destroys the casual feel that this game is frankly supposed to have. or the continually infuriating problems of how damage actually ends up working out in these games, where you'll be moving along, you'll run into cover, and you'll be taking hits, but you'll die when you're behind cover because on the enemy's screen, you weren't actually in cover yet when that final shot was fired, so you go down, but on your screen, it looks like you actually managed to get to cover, and that's always infuriating, always has been, always will be. And similarly infuriating is the idea of a sort of super bullet, where the enemy will be shooting at you and they will hit you on their screen what looks like multiple times, but when you actually receive that damage on your end, it looks like you only got hit once. So you take about 4 or 5 bullets worth of damage, but it looks like they only shot you once, and obviously that's just going to feel like complete BS. Like I said, it's something that is absolutely infuriating, and it has plagued this series for a long time, but to be fair, it's a problem that plagues a lot of online shooters because it's just baked into the very nature of client-server connections and the latency that everybody is experiencing there. There's only so much you can do to reduce that problem. But weirdly enough, it is less noticeable on games with a shorter TTK, and the TTK with Black Ops 6 was expanded compared to the Modern Warfare games. So the Modern Warfare games have a very fast TTK, so you're not necessarily going to notice when enemies get those super bullet effects going on. It's not going to feel quite as annoying. Whereas in Black Ops 6, they opted for a longer TTK, although not quite as long as some other games, and so you notice that effect a lot more. Then, of course, there's the ever-annoying update requires restart prompt, where you boot the game up, and because it just had to do some sort of update, now you have to restart the game again, even though the update was already applied, so it basically has to apply the update twice, and the continually irritating problem of them trying to consolidate all of the Call of Duty franchise into one launcher, effectively. So even though you only want to play one particular game in the franchise, you still have to install the general Call of Duty application, and then within that it has the components of the game you want to play. So if you want to play Black Ops 6 multiplayer campaign or zombies, then you have to select that specific component, and depending on which component it is, it might have to relaunch the app entirely. So to simply play one of these components, let's say campaign, you might have to boot up the Call of Duty general app, and of course it has to restart because it just had updates, so it gives you the update requires restart prompt, and you have to restart the game. Then when you get back to this menu, you select the campaign app, and so it has to shut down the general app and then relaunch the campaign app, and then if you want to quit that, then you need to specify that you want to exit to desktop rather than simply quit, because if you try to simply quit, then it will bring back up the general app, so then you had to quit out of that too. It's just really obnoxious at this point. I mean, the updated engine that Modern Warfare 2019 brought to the table was supposed to be a breath of fresh air for the franchise, a revitalization of it, and at the time, it was. And then they just kept making it more of this cobbled together mess as time went on. So now by the time you get to Black Ops 6, you've just had years and years of these same problems repeating themselves over and over and over again, and just gradually wearing on you this entire time. No individual one of these issues is enough to tank the entire experience, but they're all irritants, and it adds up. And when you combine that with the specific problems that Black Ops 6 has, then the whole house of cards just comes tumbling down. I mean, let's face it, they pretty much phoned this one in. Obviously, the people working on the campaign put some effort into it, but when you look at the multiplayer, it is just a complete shit show, for lack of a better way of describing it. There is not a single good map in this entire game. All of them are cramped. All of them are designed to be 3 lanes, or as I generally refer to them, 3-lane garbage, because that's what Treyarch has been crapping out over the past decade or so. While aesthetically there is a good amount of variety to them, in terms of their actual flow, in terms of how they actually play, there's basically none. They all feel very, very similar to one another, and none of them feel good to play. It doesn't help that they introduced the omni-movement system, which means that you can sprint forward, backward, left, or right, and of course you can slide, and you can dive, and lay on the ground afterwards, and that sort of thing. With the way they described it being that you're supposed to be moving like an action hero, when the reality is it's floaty and clunky and has a nasty habit of not really doing what you want it to do. I will be fair in saying that they have definitely improved it since I originally played this game back during the beta. It does feel a bit better than that, but you still never really feel like you have full control over your character. Everything still just feels a bit slippery, and you'll find yourself doing things that you never really intended to do, and more often than not, that will result in your untimely demise, whether it be by simply sliding off the map somehow, or getting stuck on something in the environment, or just not really moving where you intended to move, and so it throws your aim off. It's a mess. And it's only made worse by the level of players that you will encounter that feel the need to be constantly slipping and sliding and bouncing all over the damn place, almost like they've just downed about half a dozen energy drinks, and so they're just bouncing off the walls themselves, and it's reflected in their gameplay. They're trying way too hard to be MLG, or what the hell ever you want to call it, and it just drags down the entire experience. But while that was meant to be the big game changer, the only other thing they really added to the gameplay this time around is the specialization system, where if you get all perks of the same color, which are either blue, green, or red, then that will unlock an additional specialization perk that will give you effectively a fourth perk for it. And the really silly part is there's only one of them that's actually worth using, and that is the blue one, because that will allow you to see where enemies are whenever you respawn. When you respawn, it will show red outlines of where the enemies are for a very brief period, although I do have to say they have at least tried to balance it somewhat compared to back when it was wildly overpowered during the beta. It lasted way too long. With the full release, they reduced the amount of time that it shows where the enemies are to the point where it's basically just a brief flash whenever you spawn back in, but that's enough to do what you need to do with it. But even after effectively being nerfed, it's still just way more powerful than both of the other specializations, so there's still not really much reason to use anything but that one. So that means that the only other really new-ish mechanic that they put into this was basically a joke. Aside from that, it's basically just copy-pasting the Call of Duty gameplay formula over into yet another game with a slightly different theme compared to the previous one. And since they made the TTK in this game slower than the Modern Warfare franchise, it means that pretty much all of the guns feel like crap to use. I have just lost track of the amount of times where it just feels like I'm shooting blanks at enemies because I am doing what feels like so little damage to them, I might as well be just hurling harsh language at them. The sheer number of hit markers you will see, including headshot hit markers and not drop enemies, is downright absurd in this thing, for a Call of Duty game at least. It's still certainly not the absolute worst this series has ever experienced in that regard. That would be Black Ops 4, which was just utterly atrocious in that regard. But the TTK in this still feels way too long, and it feels like you experience way too many headshot hit markers even, so it just ends up making the gunplay feel like a downgrade compared to pretty much all of the previous entries going back to when they changed over the engine. The only other one that feels kind of close to that is Black Ops Cold War, funnily enough, and even that still felt better than this, even though it was actually on an older version of the engine that wasn't the updated one that was introduced in Modern Warfare 2019. That was just utterly baffling. But anyway, the point here is that even though Black Ops 6 does have the same general gameplay loop that is well known for the Call of Duty franchise at this point, and on a baseline level that is solid, thus preventing this game from falling into being an outright awful game, the adjustments they made to the mechanics and the problems with the engine and such all add up to make the experience worse than most of the previous games since Modern Warfare 2019. But the weird thing is, everything I've talked about up to this point was not the ultimate deal breaker for me on this game. The deal breaker that ultimately made me just stop playing it and decide I am not going to bother finishing this game for review is how little the developers gave a shit. Now that has already been abundantly clear from everything I've talked about to this point, but it goes beyond that. Let's start with the game's theme. It's set in 1991, and as of additional story updates as the seasons have progressed, that has progressed into the following year, 1992. This means a couple of things. The first is that they are clearly targeting 90s nostalgia with this one, meaning that you're looking at roughly millennials and Gen X for the target audience. And yet, they're just going to get I'm too old for this shit vibes from the way the game plays. That's bad enough on its own, but then they couldn't even be bothered to actually stick to 90s nostalgia. Oh sure, the environments look fine, but then you look at things like the tactical gear that everybody's using, the optics that you're seeing on the various weapons, and hell, a lot of the weapons themselves, and you're just dealing with anachronism after anachronism, and some of them are particularly egregious. It's one thing if, say, you look at the USP in the game, or I should say the legally distinct GS45. Anyway, the real-life gun that's based on, the H&K USP, didn't get put into production until 1993. That's not that egregious, it's only about a year or two off. Okay, whatever. But then you look at something a bit more egregious, like the Gepard PDW, which is a cool inclusion, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't even introduced as a prototype until 1995 and never actually went into production. Now you might be saying at this point, oh, okay, DW, that's kind of bad, but hey, it's supposed to be a Black Ops game, so obviously they're going to have access to bleeding-edge prototypes, and that may even include things that are a bit anachronistic. Okay, fine. But you know what? I can probably suspend disbelief of something that's even about 4 or 5 years out, but then you have stuff like the PP90M1, which wasn't even developed until 1998 through 2000, and then there's the really egregious ones that were introduced in the 2000s, like the CR56 AMAX, as they call it in the Call of Duty series now, which is the Galil Ace rifle, which didn't see development until 2008, and far worse than that, the so-called Kilo 141, which is the analog of the H&K 433, which didn't even enter production until 2022. And the really frustrating thing is, even when they do get things that are closer to period accurate to 1991 and 92, or they get things that are actually period accurate, they still find ways to screw that up. The AUG, for example, the Steyr AUG. Well, to some degree, it is actually period accurate to the 90s. That rifle actually goes back to the 1970s. But the version that was available in 1991 did not have a bolt catch on the side of the gun. Instead of just pressing a button on the side of it, if you wanted to reload it back then, you had to pull the charging handle to the rear, lock it up in the upward position, drop the old mag, put a new mag in, and then slap the charging handle down, or you simply had to drop the mag, put a new mag in, and then rack the charging handle. That bolt catch wasn't put on the AUG until the A3 models, which didn't start production until 2005. And then there's ones that are just completely baffling as to how they've been implemented in the game. I mean, the USP, the GS45, has 10-round magazines, even though the witness holes on the magazine clearly show that it's supposed to have way more than 10 rounds. And more importantly, actual USP45s have 12-round magazines by default. And yet, there's also the Makarov PM, which is referred to as the 9mm PM in this for some baffling reason. And it also has 10-round magazines, even though the actual Makarovs only have 8-round magazines. It's the kind of thing that just leaves you sitting there scratching your head, and then there's even more baffling decisions than that. You look at stuff like the so-called Strider 22, which is based on the Grendel P30, and the so-called Tonto 22, which is based on the Grendel R31, and they're both chambered in .22 Magnum, which is a caliber that absolutely no operator in their right mind would ever be caught using because it's rimfire, so it's very unreliable compared to centerfire ammunition, and more importantly, that's a varmint round. It is meant for small game like rabbits and groundhogs and such. It is not the kind of thing you want to be deliberately taking into a battle. And yet, the so-called Tonto 22 depicts it as being way more powerful than it actually is, presumably because they decided they wanted a relatively slow-firing submachine gun and thought, you know what, this looks cool, we'll just make it work somehow. It's just a baffling decision. I mean, they could have put in the FNP90. That actually would have been bleeding-edge technology for 1991, because those were developed in 1990, and the FN57, the pistol that's chambered in the same round, was developed a bit later on. It was around the same time as the USP, actually. It was 93 or so. So they could say that those are bleeding-edge technology in this particular game and kind of get away with the anachronistic part of using the 5.7, but basically achieve the same effect with that pistol as what we actually have in the game, chambered in 22 Magnum. And then the submachine gun would effectively be a replacement for the PP90 M1, which is very anachronistic, because it would serve the same function as a gun with a higher capacity and higher fire rate, but lower damage. And then they could have swapped out the Tonto 22 with something that would make more sense for a slower firing but higher damage submachine gun, like, say, something chambered in 45 or 40 or 10mm or something like that. But they chose not to do that, and thus we're left with really bizarre choices there. But you know what the really funny thing about all of this is? As annoying as all of these things are to people who know anything about how firearms work, anybody who knows anything about firearms of the 90s that would have been cool to include in a game like this, those are actually the mild ones. You want the really egregious, really stupid, downright brain-melting crap. You look at things like the double barrel attachment for the SA-80, which that gun's cursed enough already. You don't need to make it even more cursed. Or you look at the various attachments for the Set Me Model L, which is actually depicted pretty well in this game, weirdly enough. And somehow, if you slap a few different attachments on it, it turns into a Sturmgewehr 44, which makes no sense at all because they are not remotely the same gun. And then you look at the so-called skull splitter barrel for the Makarov, which turns it into effectively a 44 auto mag, which will drop enemies in a single headshot at up to medium range, and it might take multiple at long range, but even at short to medium range, even if you're just getting body shots, it will take them down in 2 instead of about 4 or 5 like it does if you don't have that barrel equipped. Which is beyond absurd, because it's still a Makarov chambered in 9x18, which is not a particularly powerful round. It is barely more powerful than 380, which is generally considered these days to be the bare minimum for self-defense use. The especially frustrating thing is, they don't have a gun in this game that fits the same role that, say, the Desert Eagle does in most of the other Call of Duty games where it's depicted. Which is to say, a low-capacity, high-powered semi-automatic that is tricky to use, but is obviously very satisfying to pull off. Instead, they've got two very middle-of-the-road pistols that have highly limited fire rates, which is really annoying. They have a very low damage but high rate of fire and high capacity pistol, and they have a machine pistol in the form of the APS Stechkin, which they call the Grakova for some baffling reason. And up until Season 5, that was it. Once you get to Season 5, they introduce what they call the Gravemark 357, which is a Colt SAA that is chambered in 357 Magnum, and so that covers the revolver role for this particular game. So you got relatively low rate of fire, high power, relatively high recoil, low capacity kind of thing going on, but I'll come back to that one, because there's something particularly egregious about that that really irritates the shit out of me. Anyway, the point here is that there was an opening to put the kind of handgun that they're going for with this skull splitter attachment, and yet they just chose not to stick one in there. They could have put in an AMP automag if they wanted to keep that aesthetic, even though that gun's a complete piece of crap, or they could have put in a Desert Eagle because those were in production starting in the 80s. So it's not like it wouldn't be period appropriate, at least, and especially if they're going for the whole move like an action hero thing. Well, there aren't that many handguns that really scream action movie star like a friggin' Desert Eagle does, so they could have just gone that route and actually had everything work out pretty well, but they just chose not to. Instead, they decided to shove in this incredibly cursed Makarov attachment. So that's just plain stupid, even though they probably thought it was awesome. And then you get to the two weapons that really just give me a headache. And those are the Essex Model 7, as they refer to it, which is their equivalent of a Winchester 1895, and the Gravemark 357 as they refer to it, which is the Colt Single Action Army. Now, the Winchester 1895 is one of my favorite rifles of all time. I just think they're awesome. I am a sucker for lever actions in general, but I think that the 1895 is really slept on. It's a really cool design. It's chambered in some fun rounds, and of course, if you've got the 405 Winchester variant, then that's good old Teddy Roosevelt's big medicine right there, so you got some real badass power going on with that. And then, of course, the Single Action Army is probably the most iconic handgun of all time. I mean, even people who know nothing about guns will recognize a Single Action Army as, at the very least, the Peacemaker or that cowboy gun, because it's in pretty much every Western imaginable. It's just an absolute classic piece of Americana, and when I saw that they were implementing that, and they implemented the 1895 Winchester, or their version of it, into the game, I was actually looking forward to that, because that meant I could make a proper gunslinger loadout and just run around going all, "You've yeed your last haul!" And those two weapons were released in back-to-back seasons. So you had the Winchester in Season 4, and you had the Single Action Army in Season 5. And don't get me wrong, there's some weird stuff with the Winchester. One of the attachments is for detachable box magazines, which just, no, that's just not how that gun works at all. So that's just downright ridiculous. And in addition to the obviously cursed attachments that you can throw on there, like very modern optics, which just look hideous on a classically styled lever action rifle, or classically styled rifle of any kind, they've also implemented clip reloading, which only one variant of the actual 1895 ever had. That was the version chambered in 7.62x54 rimmed, and that was because the Imperial Russian Army during World War I needed more rifles than just what Mosin Nagants they had, and so they contracted a whole bunch of Winchester 1895s chambered in that round, and those had a clip guide on them, so they could still use their Mosin clips with it. But that was the only variant that had them. The rest were all just sporting rifles, where you had to load each individual round into the magazine. But I would be mostly okay with the clip-based reloading if it were actually chambered in a round that the actual Winchester 1895s were chambered in. Instead, they decided to chamber it in .308 and give it 3 extra rounds than it can actually hold, which is baffling, but I can get past that. What I can't get past is what they did to the Single Action Army. So not only does it take multiple headshots to bring an enemy down with it, meaning that it doesn't really feel good to use, but they decided that arguably the most iconic handgun of all time, a gun that everyone, even people who have no knowledge of guns, knows is a 6-shooter, meaning it holds 6 rounds in the cylinder, should hold 8 rounds. Even though every single model of the cylinder that's available, so all the different magazine attachments, every single one of them only holds 6 rounds. So there's just 2 magic phantom rounds in this thing. When I saw that the first time, I just sat there and stared at the screen in disbelief. No, they couldn't possibly have taken one of the most iconic firearms of all time, one that literally everyone knows only holds 6 rounds, and somehow magically make it hold 2 extra rounds without modeling it on the cylinder. No. 6-round cylinders, regardless of which magazine attachment you have. But if you have the default magazine, then you just load 2 extra rounds in there that won't fit in it. Whereas the so-called fast mag attachments that will make your reload speed a lot faster not only hold 6 rounds visually, but they hold 6 rounds in terms of actual game logic, so you have the appropriate capacity. So you have to get attachments to make the iconic 6-shooter an actual 6-shooter. It just, the first thing that went through my head when I saw that was that I couldn't understand how they could fuck up something that fundamental, but then I remembered it's because they just don't care. They don't care if anything is accurate, they don't care if anything is anachronistic or not. They're basically just going through the motions, throwing out whatever slop they can put together in order to keep the content rolling in. And the only people who seem to be putting any actual amount of effort in are the people who do the modeling, the texture work, and the animations. But even in those departments, you can tell where they were just lifting content from previous games, particularly with the weapons that straight up returned from previous games in the series, like the so-called Kilo 141 or CR56 AMAX. So unfortunately, even when there are certain things that are done well, sometimes it's because they were done well in a previous entry in the series. I mean, they're so phoning everything in that they're even using AI to generate the calling cards and such, and it is just downright pathetic. But you know what the really weird thing is? Even as obnoxious as all that stuff is, the one thing that finally was the tipping point for me was something that I was able to put up with in Modern Warfare 2022 and 2023, and that is the cosmetics. Because as bad as things got in those previous games with the likes of Alucard and Nicki Minaj and such running around, somehow they managed to make Black Ops 6 even worse in that regard. Because now you've got the theming-appropriate Black Ops characters running around, alongside their counterparts with Zombies mode cosmetics attached to them, meaning that they're zombies or otherwise weird sci-fi abominations, and they're also running around alongside the Replacer, which at the very least I'll say is a Black Ops in-joke. I'll give them that. That's at least appropriate for the Black Ops franchise, even if it's a bit weird. And even then, it's just a guy in a suit, so it's not that crazy. But then you've got characters from Squid Game, because why not? Just why not throw in Squid Game, or, you know, Roger and Stan from American Dad, or Beavis and Butthead, or the Ninja Turtles, or the T-800 Terminator, or as of the most recent season of content, the Predator from the Predator franchise, and frickin' Chucky and the Bride of Chucky. Because, you know, that's what we really need to be seeing in a game that's supposed to be about clandestine operations in the modern day. That's definitely what we need to be seeing. Really nailing that modern military shooter aesthetic with all of these frickin' cartoon characters running around alongside horror movie villains. Call of Duty has just become a complete mockery of itself. This series used to take itself pretty seriously. It might have an occasional joke here or there, don't get me wrong, to lighten up the mood, but generally speaking, they were rather grounded. They took themselves seriously. They really tried to be authentic to things like the kind of gear you were using and the environments you would be running around in, and make sure that everything was at least appropriate to the setting and the aesthetic that they established both in the campaign and just the game in general. And then you get to the more modern entries, Modern Warfare 2022, 2023, and Black Ops 6, not to mention the absolute shit show that was Vanguard, and Activision's basically tried to turn this thing into Fortnite, because they see Fortnite making all of that money from all the crossovers, and they're like, hey, we can do that in Call of Duty, except it doesn't make sense for Call of Duty to do it, so they do it anyway, and of course it sells, because, you know, the people who play Call of Duty will just buy whatever slop is thrown in front of them, apparently. And so they make a ton of money from these really shitty cosmetics, and they're like, hey, we can just keep doing this. So they keep doubling down and tripling down, and now we're at the point where Black Ops 6 is just a fucking disaster, to put it lightly. I mean, hell, the backlash against these cosmetics has gotten so severe that Activision actually felt the need to say that with the upcoming game, they're going to try to remain true to the aesthetic of that game. Which, to put it very bluntly, I don't believe for a second. I am fully convinced that they might lay low for a season or two, but eventually they will return to these really shitty cosmetics that just completely ruin whatever semblance of aesthetic the game could possibly have. Because at the end of the day, they don't care what the fans think. They don't care what their players think. The only thing they care about is money. And that means the only message that's going to get through to them is to simply stop giving them your money. And given the trajectory this series is headed in, that's getting increasingly easy to do. Trust me, that's $70 US for the standard edition, or $100 US for the whatever they call it, the Vault Edition, the Black Cell Edition, I don't know what they call it anymore, and I don't really care. But regardless, that money could be spent on so many other things that aren't Call of Duty Black Ops 6 or the upcoming Black Ops 7, and will be infinitely more worth your time and money than the utter slop that Treyarch and Activision are shoveling out these days. Hell, at this point, it's pretty much the entire AAA industry that you can say that about, but Treyarch and Activision especially, because they are just driving this franchise into the ground full steam ahead, and seem to think they're too big to fail at this point. Well, when you have that level of hubris, inevitably you're going to prove to everyone that it is not in fact too big to fail. So, if they keep on the current course, they're probably going to hit that point sooner rather than later. But as for whether enough people stop giving them their money for them to actually feel the need to course correct, well, that's another matter entirely. I guess we'll just have to wait and see here. I know that Battlefield 6 has been selling really well, but that is probably not really going to make much of a dent in their plans, especially considering that Battlefield 6 compromises what makes the Battlefield series work in the first place in favor of trying to cater to the Call of Duty crowd with a game that's more or less become Call of Duty's ground war mode, but with much clunkier mechanics, and it really doesn't work out well for it. But that's the subject for a different video, one that will be hopefully coming out fairly soon here, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, I have rambled and ranted and raved quite enough for one video here, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it there. If you have any further questions, feel free to throw them in the comments. I'll see about answering them. But the short version here is Call of Duty Black Ops 6 is just not worth your time or money unless you get it on sale for a really, really, really deep discount. I'm talking maybe $20 or less at absolute most. And, well, with the way Activision prices everything these days, and with the way they handle sales on their games, well, good luck getting it at a price like that. But that is the only price point I would really be willing to recommend this game at. I won't be giving it a score like I normally do with reviews, because again, this isn't actually a full review. It's a fairly unhinged rant and ramble about the game, but it is what it is, I suppose. I hope you all enjoyed the video regardless. I hope you all found it useful or informative, or at least just cathartic. I know I certainly needed to get a rant like this out of my system, so it's definitely helpful for me at least. But anyway, thank you all very much for watching. Thanks for bearing with me during all this here. Stay tuned for more videos. The next big review is going to be the Battlefield 6 review, so stay tuned for that. Should be coming up within the next week or so. And I'll see you all in later videos.